All right. It looks like everything is good to go. Can I get the first speaker of the proposition to read out the wording of the motion?
This would require meat packaging to include graphic images of animal suffering.
Can you please repeat that?
This house would require meat packaging to include graphic images of animal suffering.
Great. Can I get the first opposition speaker to confirm that you have the same wording of the same motion?
Yes, we do.
Lovely. Without further ado, I invite the first speaker of the proposition to open the debate. Here.
Can I just check that everyone can hear me clearly?
Yep.
Cool. I'll take POIs in chat, but I'll likely just call for one on my speech. When legislation was put in place to put the packaging on cigarettes for lung cancer and the other diseases you can get from it, people became aware that what their consumption really meant and its implications on their health. That led to a major collapse which occurred so that people stopped smoking or at least tried to reduce their consumption, and there was greater public awareness on the subject. Note that transition in a very similar manner cigarette packaging. On our side of the house, this looks like graphic images of factory farm conditions and the cramped conditions of which they're kept in for the purpose of being slaughtered down the line. Note, we do not think it is necessary to have involve animals being killed and cut, which include blood, because this is considered triggering and should not be displayed in the supermarkets. Note this also only applies to commercial meat consumption. For example, local farmers, hunters, and indigenous communities are not included as they raise their livestock for their community or their own consumption and do not buy packaged meat. 3 substantives for you today. Firstly, on the decreasing consumption of meat. Secondly, on the increased pressure for more ethical practices in the meat. And thirdly, a principle on consumer awareness and the freedom of choice. Firstly, decreasing the consumption of meat. So why is so important? I think it's intuitive to the point the immense harm and suffering animals undergo, which their life that has to end in order to supermarkets. Factory farming practices raise animals in confined conditions, which leads to the disease and stress for livestock. And this also means that they have routinely been given growth hormones and other artificial sources so they can be in this peak condition for human consumption. It is so unethical to the point where we treat living beings as a mass-produced product. Secondly, it's also important because the increase in countries, the United States and other developed nations, as a result of mass and not home scale deforestation occur livestock grazing. These populations are over-consuming meat to an that and thus contribute to an increased greenhouse gas emissions, which are like a large proportion contributor to climate change. And there are huge amounts of vulnerable of land and the harsh conditions as a result of climate change. So why does consumption of meat decrease these graphic images? First, the presence of graphic imagery evokes a feeling of disgust, increases willingness to purchase meat.
P1.
The person is standing in the it is likely to catch their attention and stop them from mindless. Yes.
Speaker, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but you seem to be lagging quite badly. I've paused your time at 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Would you like to drop off the call and turn on flight mode and then turn it off and then try to rejoin and continue from where you left off?
Okay, cool. Yeah, I might just join with my data then.
Yeah, that's all right.
Also, Muku, if it's okay, to help the speaker's internet, would you mind turning off your camera? Maybe.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep. Out the motion. Did you try reading out the motion?
This has require meat packaging to include graphic images of animals.
Slightly lagging, but I think we can try for the time being, and if it's not workable, I will let you know.
Okay.
Right. So your time cut off at
Do
2 minutes,
where do you
30
want me to
seconds.
start from?
I think
Okay.
up until 2 minutes 30, you were pretty audible. So I think you can continue from there. The last thing I have from you is where you were talking about overconsumption of meat contributing to increased greenhouse gas emissions and all the harsh conditions and how then the harsh conditions that emerge as a result of climate change.
Okay, great. Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So why does the consumption of meat decrease with these graphic images? Firstly, graphic imagery evokes a feeling of disgust that decreases willingness to purchase meat. When a person is standing in line, imagery is likely to catch their attention and stop them from mindfully picking up the meat, taking a moment to pause and reflect on what this product actually has, where it has actually come from. Secondly, the shock value and the controversy that is generated is likely to prompt some discussion on the topic. For those who are not deterred by the imagery, there's still an effect of considering what meat consumption actually means that is likely to reduce meat consumption on an intellectual level. Then thirdly, there is an increased culture to stop excessive meat consumption, as those influenced by the images will decrease their consumption and to become maybe vegetarian. Those on the cusp of that will become vegetarian, and in general, the community will subconsciously decrease as well. This occurs because you have a lot more conversations about the industry. You also get increased media exposure as there is a market to have these discussions, and also your immediate friend group will begin to likely decrease consumption, and you follow in solidarity or convenience because you are close to these individuals. And fourthly, as meat consumption is reduced, the incentive for companies to provide non-meat alternatives rises. The accessibility and convenience meat consumption increases. So in turn, individuals are able to eat less and have more of a plant-based diet. Note that we're not completely ruling out meat consumption in any way. Now, the impacts of this point is absolutely massive to the point where you are able to decrease greenhouse gas emissions with the overall decrease in meat consumption because of supply and demand, where less people are demanding for the extra meat and instead looking for more sustainable alternatives, which reduces the amount of land taken for grazing and the water for processing meat. In development, you have an consumption of meat, reduced risk of diseases, and in the long term, such as a diet of lower processed and red meats means you get a decreased risk of cardiovascular diseases and diabetes, which we've seen has spiked in recent times with the increase in meat consumption in these nations. This is a huge benefit to the health of humans, which leads to benefits in the health system. There are also fewer animals who have to suffer in the sake of human consumption. Now I'll go into our second substantive on the increased pressure industry to have more ethical and sustainable practices. POI.
Yeah, so meat is an integral part of people's culture and identity. Do you think they're willing to give that up?
We're telling you that ruling out consumption of meat. We're trying to decrease it, and we've told you in indigenous communities or farming communities where it is a large part of their culture, but they are not consuming on a commercial level. This does not impact them as such. This is more just the mass production of meat, the meat industry. Okay, two layers of analysis. Firstly, on consumer behavior, and secondly, on media pressure. When consumers see this graphic imagery and it goes to the ethical practice to go and do research into the meat industry, while it is unlikely that every person will stop eating altogether, consumers still eat meat, want to be for it to be. If all your friends are going to be vegetarian, there's an immense social pressure to conform to this new normal. And by researching and having knowledge over which brands have more ethical practices, you feel justified to explain to your friends why they can still consume meat, but in an ethical manner. So this means that you have this pressure incentivizes the industry to innovate and have these ethical practices which relieve suffering and their mass production method. Now to media. When a policy that affects such a large part of society comes into play, there is guaranteed to be a huge media attention around it. The job of the informed citizen is to see news sources reporting on this policy. This looks like evaluating how accurate to real life the pictures are and informing consumers on which business have the best practices. They are likely to do this because they have to cater to their consumers who will be interested in digging deeper into production meat. As we have told you, consumers are going to be uncomfortable looking at the imagery and will likely cut Additionally, we have explained that they would want to be like they're going to want a source of meat that comes from ethical companies. This also looks like day-to-day interactions by like influencers. When influencers are more incentivized to put out content that is consumer conscious, they are likely to not want to advertise products that involve human suffering. They want to like advocate for products that are more ethical because they both have the responsibility and the pressure from the audience and the influence they have over consumption, like stop incentivizing people buying products for animal cruelty. The media is hugely influential. It has a large sway of the public, is targeted and shown to have practices are going to face huge pressure and a huge incentive to change their ways in which they produce meat. We see this happening for hens, like it was publicized throughout the media in the banning of battery cages in Europe and Canada as well as New Zealand. So we think all should stand to the point that we are able to decrease meat consumption, which has huge impacts on the animal livelihoods as well as the livelihoods of humans and their health.
The House thanks the first proposition speaker for that speech and now invites the first speaker of the opposition to open the case for the opposition bench. Hear, hear. Hello, is the speaker on the call?
Yeah, I'm just getting my timer set up.
Uh-huh.
Begin. Before I start, I'd just like to briefly mention how there was some attempted motion scrolling about making graphic imagery less graphic, even though the motion specified graphic imagery, to make it easier for them to win. We will try to do our best anyways, but just keep this in mind as I begin. The main way we'll be attempting to win this debate is through two methods, either proving that it just does not change people's habits, or even if it does, it has more net harms than good, right? I'll start with some broader rebuttal before going to my first point on why it just won't work, and my second point on why even if it does, it will just have more harms than actual benefits, right? So first, on some rebuttal. They made this entire like big comparison to how cigarettes, and it worked for cigarettes in New Zealand when they put graphic imagery there. But this is vastly, vastly different, right? Cigarettes were largely, it just did not work for cigarettes, right? You could argue it was more like better education around the harms of cigarettes in schools rather than showing graphic imagery of what cigarettes did to you, right? And meat is just structurally different to cigarettes because cigarettes cause yourself like own personal harms to yourself rather than some vague distant harm to some other animal, right? It was much more personal to people. They also said the entire case pretty much hinged around consumers caring a lot, which I'll rebut more on my first point. But they also mentioned how like media will universally have like huge influence. They'll all start pushing for like better animal rights, but not all media companies will just care. Like some might push the other way. And if they have a massive influence, as they've said, then if Fox News is campaigning against this, then their massive influence would go and work against them, right? They also brought up this weird point on better health, even though like animal meat is like not actually that unhealthy compared to other things like sugar, which is much worse and arguably a much bigger cause of cardiovascular disease. You can see how people drink way too much sugar, right? So this seems like a weird point to bring up overall. They also talked about how like people will pause while they shop and look really deeply into this, but people are just shopping for food. Like, do you think they want to have a deep think about what they're looking at, like where the source of everything they have comes from? Especially when like I'll get started on my first point right now, especially when like the average person doesn't care about politics, right? They just want to enjoy their good, yummy meat. They don't really care about like all this political stuff, right? So first, why this doesn't work? Well, for most people, eating meat is a habit, right? They just have a preference for meat. It's something they do. It's just something they go around and enjoy on their weekend. They look forward to it. They don't want to stop that, right? There's also general apathy. Like NZ cigarettes show graphic imagery, right? And we already discussed they did not really work to change people's habits because they just didn't really care, right? People just don't care about human suffering either, which we could argue people should have more empathy for because they can relate to it more as a human to another human. But we see in conflicts such as the Gaza conflict or the Ukraine war, people just don't really tend to care that much. They will look at it for a little bit, be wow, that's really bad, and then just start ignoring it because people become desensitized to this stuff over time. Look at like the protests in Hong Kong, right? People just don't care about it anymore. It slips from their memory because they just became desensitized to it, got tired of it, and just stopped caring, right? And even then, we say there'll be lots of animosity. Context, people already hate animal rights organizations. Look at PETA, how much hate they have, and look at how much hate other influences of the animal rights movement, e.g. the vegan teacher, just attract so much animosity already. This gives groups that are against animal rights ammunition to fire at animal rights groups when this type of stuff starts occurring, because society does not want people, especially children, to be exposed to graphic imagery in any way, shape, or form. We can already see this through PEGI 15 and PEGI 18 ratings on films, on media, because they do not want to expose children to graphic images of suffering or whatnot, right? They do not want this stuff to happen, and they will become angry if it starts to happen to one of the most vulnerable people in society, which is children, right? And also, a lot of people are just very attached to eating meat in the first place. It's traditionally like very masculine thing. It's tied to like the idea of masculinity. So a lot of men find it very important that they can have and consume meat freely of their own volition, right? Without anyone trying to stop them, because it's a massive part of their identity. It's also very culturally accepted in wide parts of the world. Like look at Thanksgiving in America, they eat a whole turkey every time. It's just a very culturally accepted thing to do, right? And additionally, more extreme people, not just the average person who doesn't care about politics, really don't want to give it up. Think like blood red Republicans who see it as an even bigger part of their identity and will see it as an attack, right? The outcome of this is people will, first of all, just keep buying meat anyways because they just don't care, right? Like nothing actually will change. People just keep eating it. And in fact, it may just cause anguish to children. Then they have to look at their favorite food, and then they see like some animal suffering imagery, which they have no agency to stop or to control because they aren't the ones buying the food in the first place. They are just the ones that have to follow their parents into the supermarket to get food to eat, right? And second of all, it sparks rage, right? Like protests. People get mad that this is happening. Like in our world, we have like animal rights protests, right? In their world, there will be the opposite. There will be like protests against this sort of thing happening, right? Protests for the meat industry. They won't want more measures passed, and animal rights will start to slowly stop because people are so outraged about this that animal rights movements cannot press for more without threatening to spark more rage, right? And at the most extreme end, this looks like Republicans and people like that buying more meat out of rage. Think about like when Bud Light had that trans woman on their alcohol, they'll be really upset, right? And they'll just start to buy even more, right? And if we win this, right, it becomes a wash with like we win on protests and children. So at this point, you should weigh very highly, because if we win, at this point, we just win the debate, right? I'll take a POI now.
When you mentioned that consumers don't actually care, what about the emotional and also the behavior about the pressure and the community of individuals around them?
So first of all, people like if they had an emotional response to it, right, and that means they probably already care about animal well-being and animal rights, right? So they'll probably just not be buying meat in the first place anyways. So now they just have to suffer even more. And the point on like community hinges on your entire point working in the first place. So it doesn't really matter at all if no one just cares at all. And now I'll get stuck into my second point about even if it does work. So first of all, even if it does work, this hurts the meat industry globally, as I've stated. Like meat is typically produced by less developed communities and nations, right? It's not a very high level industry that like makes billions of dollars per meat sold. Like think about how much meat you need to sell to make $1,000. It's quite a bit. So it will hurt people that don't have like access to better opportunities typically. And then all of a sudden demand has fallen for these struggling farmers who often barely scrape by because it's not got very high profit margins, right? And you could say, well, they'll just swap to making something else like crops, which are like historically the backbone of nations, think agricultural revolution. But if they could, then why wouldn't they? Like there has to be a reason they have not swapped to something else, right? Maybe there's a lack of arable land. Maybe they don't have the skill set or knowledge to swap, right? And additionally, there's less incentive to pursue nicer farming methods generally because meat will be associated with these graphic images anyways overall. And why should they swap and take a less efficient route of production when there are already so many graphic images associated with meat now? If this did work, why would they take that risk and be less efficient overall when they will just see that they could make more by being more efficient because they already have such bad appeal now, right? So the outcome of this, my second speaker can break into the outcomes of this, I'm sure. Thank you for, yeah.
The House thanks the first opposition speaker for that speech. We now invite the second proposition speaker to continue the case for the government bench. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, I can't turn my camera on for Wi-Fi reasons, unfortunately. I'll take
That's right.
POIs in the chat, but I'm likely to ask in my speech as well. Okay. Three things to do in my speech. Firstly, a little bit of clarification on like the implementation and the accusations of squirreling we heard come out at first, Nick. Secondly, I want to address why this really does work. And a quick note on their like point about harms to the meat industry, although note that this came out at like 7 minutes. So it's pretty clear that they don't think that this is the most important material in the debate. And then finally, I'm going to give you a principle on consumer awareness and freedom of choice. And note that this is going to be very impactful to the debate, because at the point in time where NEG wants to basically claim that they've made the whole debate a wash already at first NEG, I think that this can be the difference that tips the debate either way if you really believe that material. But firstly, a couple of notes on what they told you about squirreling and our model. I think, note that at first we literally stood by putting images of chickens being hung on meat packaging. I think that that perfectly fits into the graphic nature of imagery described by the motion, but I'm also unclear on why animal suffering in factory farming is considered like not graphic. I think that that causes pretty like intense feelings of like disgust and of like upset. So I think that it can easily be considered graphic. But then the second thing here on like when they told you that like people that that sugar is a bigger killer and that we shouldn't care about the harms of overconsumption of meat at all. Sugar has nothing to do with this debate. But I think we gave you really good mechanization at Katie why any reduction in meat has this like secondary benefit to human health, even though I don't think anybody thinks this is the biggest question in the debate. But now I'm going to get into the things that they told you about why this doesn't work. We heard a couple of big pushes from NEG, and the first and most important of these was people don't care about suffering. And they gave you here the example of like Gaza conflict and like people protesting in Hong Kong, and tell you that people are just going to be desensitized. Why isn't this true? Those examples that they gave you are conflicts where people around the world are literally helpless to affect any change. The very big difference in this debate is when you are confronted with these images of animal suffering, the very easy way for you to affect change is to buy out of consuming meat, to transition to alternatives that are like just as nutritious, that are often in many cases cheaper, like lentils, like other alternative sources of protein, or even a marginal decrease in your consumption of meat if at the point in time you don't want to become vegetarian as a whole. I think what that means is that people are likely to care about suffering when they feel they can do something about it. That means the biggest push from negating doesn't stand. The second thing they told you here on why this doesn't work, though, is like this push about cultural reasons, right? People don't want to stop eating meat. They gave you the example of Thanksgiving, and they told you a little bit maybe about religious communities. I think, again, we told you down our line, we don't actually need to see everybody suddenly doesn't buy meat at all for us to win this debate, right? We only need a big decrease, or like even a relatively small decrease in people eating meat for this to be impactful. So even if you think that people are so enamored with eating meat that they need to eat their turkey for Thanksgiving, that's fine at the point in time where they are likely to buy out of meat consumption at other points in their everyday life and reduce it, like with all the mechanization that we gave you at Katie, not only around disgust, but also around, you know, like pressure from your community and around convenience at the point in time when non-meat alternatives become much more widespread. Then the last two things I want to touch on under this point are this idea of like rage and protest and reactionary backlash. So I told you about like Fox News, first of all, and negative media coverage. We actually stand by a little bit of rage bait, right? At the point in time where that means that these graphic images are also being shown on Fox News. You see them on the news at night, as well as on your meat packaging. We think that that increases the impact of the mechanization we gave you around people buying out because they feel disgust, because it's really unappetizing, right? But because they feel guilty, because they do empathize with a pig, right? It's not that different to your pet cat. Would you want to see your pet cat with its throat slit lying on the floor of a slaughter room? I don't think so. I think people are very likely to find this impactful, right? And then the other thing under this point is that Nick seriously wants to suggest to you that people are going to protest pro-meat slaughtering. I think that is like just like from a common sense basis, that is so extremely unlikely. And even if you get like a couple of rednecks who buy a little more meat, because their diet is pretty much like very meat heavy anyway, we think that this is like a very marginal change compared to the massive amount of people we see buying out from meat, even to a small degree. The last thing here is on trauma to children. I'm going to touch on this in my principle on why, even if these images are upsetting, we still stand by showing them to the public so they know what they're really doing when they eat meat. But the other thing to note here is that if you believe me when they tell you like most people don't look at the meat packaging, then I think a lot of this material falls out of the debate anyway. I'll take a POI before I move on.
A lot of this is kind of just like blanket people care about suffering. People already know animals are suffering. Why don't they care in the status quo?
In the status quo, you are so alienated from the fact that when you eat meat, you are literally eating a shrink-wrapped animal body part, right? That looks like branding that's like happy cows. I don't think that cow was actually happy when it got murdered, but people, like when you see a piece of meat in a supermarket, it doesn't look like a dead cow. It looks like a piece of meat. The change under outside the house is that you are confronted with exactly what that is. You no longer have that level of alienation. But I will touch on this more in my principle. Although first, and then just before I get into that, I'm going to touch on these things I told you about the harms to the meat industry. The major push they had for you here was that meat is like predominantly produced by poor communities, and there's going to be like a big negative economic impact. I'll tell you why this isn't true. Because there are massive like setup costs to being a meat farmer, right? You need a massive amount of land, far more than you need to grow agricultural crops. You need a lot of crops themselves to feed these animals, right? And it's also very water intensive, very labor intensive. When we look at poor agricultural communities, Nick told you themselves that they primarily grow cheap crops that are easy to grow, they're reliable, they don't aren't likely to suddenly die of a disease. So I think that it's very unlikely that you see a massive impact on the agricultural, like rural agricultural communities that are not wealthy. What actually happens is that when people transition away from meat to these like plant-based alternatives, these communities are far more likely to benefit. They're far more likely to be the communities growing things like lentils, these other meat alternatives that traditionally have been consumed by these communities for a very long time, because they are much more easy to grow, right? And because the profit is much more reliable. The second thing that they pushed on here was that there was no incentive to have better production. This totally ignores every piece of material we gave you in our second substantive, and the only mechanization they gave you was like because people aren't going to buy meat. They think that people think meat is bad anyway, so there's no incentive to have better production. If people see these bad conditions, that is the exact point in time where there is better incentive for production. I think we did that very well for you at first. Finally, then, on this principle of consumer awareness and freedom of choice. Intuitively, we think that customers have the right to know what they're consuming, what they're supporting when they buy a product. This is why we have really strict rules and regulations about how a product can be advertised. We think that freedom of choice ends at the point in time when you don't know what you're actually choosing. Like I told you in response to that POI, when you're alienated from the fact that you're eating like a dead body part, right? In order to uphold this principle, we think that consumers must therefore be confronted with the reality of meat consumption, and that includes children, right? Because consumers are intentionally alienated from the reality of what they're buying, that is a massive harm, right? Because consider the average individual is actually unlikely to be perfectly happy with slitting the throat of a chicken themselves to eat it. But we think that you need to be fully cognizant of the fact that is what you're doing by proxy when you buy meat. Even if you don't believe this, we think this principle also applies to the conditions in which an animal is raised. What does this mean for the debate? We think that OP has to explain why they are justified to break this principle. It raises the burden of proof on OP and stops them from being able to wash out the whole debate. So proud to affirm.
House thanks the second proposition speaker for that speech and now invites second opposition to continue the case for opposition bench. Here.
Okay. Am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Old MacDonald had a farm, right? E-I-E-I-O. And on side props, Dream, Woke Farm, all they have is woke soybeans irrigated with liberal tears. Unfortunately then, back on Old MacDonald's farm, realistically, under props world, just as many animals are killed, just as many are abused. So proud to oppose. 3 cuts of meat for the boulangerie today. Firstly, some ribeye rebuttal, secondly, some Wagyu Wayne, and finally, a shoulder of split. Okay, on to rebuttal. Right from the very start of the opposing side's case, what we heard is this example and allusions to cigarettes, right? We tell you this largely didn't work, but also meat is structurally different. Why? Because people care about their own suffering much more than the suffering of something that, like the opposing side admitted, is way alienated, way distanced from you. Okay. Secondly, there's this general awareness that meat is bad, right? Same with cigarettes. This is why it doesn't work. You're not adding anything to the discussion. People know what a pig looks like. Secondly, okay, it evokes disgust, right? This is the basis that both teams are working off of. Then, necessarily, side affirmative needs to prove that they turn that disgust into guilt to win the debate. Here's why that disgust doesn't become guilt, right? Okay, firstly, people have eaten meat all their lives, right? So it's not a practice that they're likely to question. Secondly, they probably already knew that like pigs are in battery farms and that live exports happen and it's a bad thing. Thirdly, everybody else they know already does it, right? So it's inherently normalized. You need so much more of a circuit breaker than just showing them pigs squashed together in order to get them to change a huge staple of their behavior. Okay, even if they do turn it into disgust, we just don't buy that this, even if they do turn it into guilt, we don't think that this guilt is likely to create change. People might just feel bad about themselves, even if we buy all the material. We do not think that it's likely that they are therefore going to change a huge part of their purchasing behavior. Note at this point that they already know the harms of their model, right? Because they're trying to reduce the people that it applies to. They say, oh, like farmers, they're not going to have to worry about it. Neither are Indigenous communities, right? They tried to tell us that Indigenous communities are separate from the big meat industry, separate from supermarkets, right? We are both from New Zealand, right? We don't have to buy this. Māori people are not roaming the Waikato hunting moa anymore, right? They go to the supermarket, they go to Countdown. And at this point, they're not likely to switch to a vegan hangi. So note that this concession doesn't work for them. Too little, too late to win here. Same for farmers, same for Native Americans, right? Everybody still goes to the super. Okay, now, just a bit of a sense check here, right? PETA still uses graphic imagery. Animal welfare organizations still use graphic imagery. Arguably, they have not produced that much change, right? The vegan industry is big, but PETA is not, no thank you, entirely successful. Why do you think you will get this change without the graphic imagery of pigs being stabbed, etc., that PETA is using without getting community change? Okay, next on community change. We've mechanized really well why you don't get individual change, right? This looks like my analysis about disgust turning into guilt, why that doesn't happen. So here are like some reasons why you don't get community change then, because you don't get individual change. Firstly, the media is unlikely to report on something that's inherently unpopular, right? We've proven why people don't care when they see it in the supermarket. So they're just going to turn the channel off, switch to a different channel if they see the news reporting on that tonight. And then secondly, even if the media does report, why do people actually care, right? If they don't care individually when they see it in the super, they're not likely to care when they see it at home. Please note this concession that we hear from the second speaker of the opposing side, right? She said, we only need a big decrease or a medium decrease, right? We tell you here that there are huge harms to even a small decrease in meat to the key stakeholders, right? Then for the opposing side to concede that they need a medium to big decrease, they inherently cannot shake off these harms. They went on to concede rage bait. They went on to concede all these other harms. You cannot win on their side of the house now. It is too late. They said you don't want to see your pet cat's throat slit and then promptly ruled out throat slitting from the meat packaging. Does not work, is not plausible. Okay. Secondly, so that was the rebuttal. Nextly, onto just a bit of analysis about the debate itself and some weighing. Okay, we told you why it doesn't work, right? For F to win, they need to prove that they reduce the number of net animals killed and they reduce the number of net animals abused. So why don't they change the number of animals abused? Because, sorry, they peg all their outcomes about like climate, health, animal welfare on these two mechs. Note they were inherently under-mechanized. Why don't they get less animals killed? Firstly, people value meat a lot. They're not likely to change their demand, their purchasing habits. Secondly, people probably just like flip the packaging around in their trolley. Like they're likely to look at it, but they're not likely to like think about it too much. Because I think we can all agree we would rather not look at pigs being crammed into a battery, shipped for live export, etc. Thirdly, it just desensitizes them to it, right? If they see lots and lots of pigs being crammed into cages, they're just going to be like, okay, this is the norm. I have no power to change this, right? I am just going to keep buying bacon. Next, we flip this, right, because of backlash. A lot of people eat more of something when the government tries to ban it. Think of Canada raw milk. Think of the United States with Bud Light, as we gave you that example at first. This happens for a few reasons. They're protesting woke things like what they think the World Economic Forum making them eat bugs, etc. Secondly, they're probably really angry, right? Because you're showing their kids graphic material. Note that if they're going to try and minimize this and say, oh, the kids aren't really harmed, they either have to concede that one, kids are seeing graphic material, or two, that they are squirreling the motion away from graphic material being visible. Okay, so now the second way to win, right? Why do they not get less animals abused? Okay, one thing that we have to note here, on our side of the house, on the status quo, there are sustainable meat companies, right? A lot of companies have make a profit and have a marketing spin of having free-range chicken, not having battery hens, etc. On our side of the house, we keep this marketing, and maybe we can, like the vegan movement can just increase the popularity of these brands. On their side of the house, they get like chickens being squashed into a boat, into cages on that packaging. So this does a few things. Firstly, it takes away from the visibility of actual sustainable meat production, right? But secondly, it also removes the marketing incentive for these companies to be sustainable. Note here, inherently and necessarily on their side, they lose the production of these sustainable companies. They lose out on some of these benefits in the status quo, right? And this is an important part of the whole debate as a whole. The vegan movement has never been higher. What the opposing side needed to do in today's debate was actually give us reasons why we need to disrupt these trends of the vegan movement going, why we need to disrupt everything else in order to get less meat production and less meat abuse. I'll take a point if you have one.
Yeah, so when you discuss the idea of the animal advocates having and unable to prove like their mission, completely different us give in a supermarket, which is a day-to-day activity.
I'm really sorry, I couldn't hear about half of that POI and I didn't time it very well because now it's out of time to ask again. But I'm assuming you're talking about the visibility of meat packaging, right? I think we can both agree kids are going to be seeing this. Moving on to my split now about further ineffectiveness, right? This largely only works in woke places like Wellington. Most of the world does not live in Wellington. Most of the world lives in the developing world. This looks like rural and indigenous populations, right? So what this means is that they have probably seen a dead chicken before. So if you stop short of showing them with chickens having their throats slit, you inherently lose out on this benefit because most of the world knows what pigs being crammed into a cage looks like, right? The shock factor doesn't work. Then there's the backlash that then there's backlash from these communities that, oh, really, the government thinks that would get us to stop eating meat. The liberal sissy boys are stopping eating meat because of this. They don't know what a chicken looks like. I'm going to buy more chicken. Secondly, on the split, right, it's just so easily circumventable. People are just going to go down to the farmer's market. Even if you buy them at their best and say that this packaging is super effective, they're just going to open up a chili bin at the farmer's market, pull out a brown paper bag and say, shh, don't tell Biden, I just bought bacon. Okay. At the end of this debate, my speech, right, we've proven why it doesn't work, why it just makes people angry, not guilty. The deadlock breakers here are the ones we've given you on backlash, reduced political capital, cost of implementing, circumventability, intense lobbying, and negative emotions. So proud to
Thank you to the second opposition speaker for that speech. A quick request before we move into the third speeches, just in the interest of having POIs being as audible as possible, please try to keep your cameras off even when you're speaking, just to make sure that the bandwidth of the call is not so excessive that POIs can't be heard and assessed by both speakers and judges. With that said, I now invite the third speaker of the proposition to summarize the case for the government bench. Here.
So just give me 1 second quickly to get my timer ready. All right, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When opposition gets up and says things such as people don't want to look at pigs being crammed into crates, this inherently supports our case and it tears down all of the material from within their own speech. They've tried to paint this picture that nobody cares and that no one's going to support it, but then they've tried to paint a very contradictory picture within their own case that people are going to be protesting and causing riots over this. And this just cannot stand in this debate. It's a huge contradiction within their case, which means that they just cannot win this debate. So what have we seen within this debate? We've seen a few points of clash. First, we've seen, are people going to care? How are people going to react? Secondly, does it impact on other minorities or vulnerable people such as children or people who relate it to their identity? And thirdly, we've seen like a slightly smaller clash just around like the developing world and like whether it's actually viable to do this. So firstly, on a large point of clash, how are people going to react to this change? Well, we have told you that it is highly, highly important that people are seeing this because, as they have told us themselves, people don't want to be seeing animals suffering. So why are we letting it continue? Why are we letting these huge industries get away with this injustice to animals and this huge, huge harm? What they tried to tell us here is 2 points, which firstly directly contradict each other. They told us, firstly, people don't care, they're going to become desensitized. But then secondly, that people care hugely, that they're going to start firing at animal rights groups and that they're going to be protesting. Firstly, I'd just like to quickly note that these two can't exist at the same time. You have to pick either one or the other, and they need to make this very clear which side they are standing with. Secondly, we tell you here that they also have not responded to our principle of choice, which is hugely important. People do care, and people also have a right to care and to know what they are caring about. On their side of the house, people just don't understand what they should be looking at and what they should be thinking about. So some rebuttal here. Firstly, we say that just people generally do care about animal rights. Like, it's not fair to say that they just don't. People have pets, people see animals all the time. The general population does have some sympathy for animals, even if it is lower. Secondly, we tell you here that imagery on meat packaging is going to be hugely, hugely more widespread than things that PETA are doing. And so this is just like not a fair comparison. It just does not stand in this debate. Secondly, we tell you that currently people are too alienated in the status quo to actually care about animals. On our side of the house, we're going to get people caring more. We are solving this issue on our side of the house, as Clara has already talked about. Thirdly, we're building in a guilt factor, a disgust factor in the younger generation. We're building this basis for people to care and for people to actually start helping animal rights groups, for people to possibly feel guilty when they do buy meat, and then they feel like they should go out and they should maybe donate to these animal rights groups or support them. We don't see people protesting for this, and even if they do, we see this being a very short-term harm compared to a very, very long-term benefit that benefits multiple generations along with all of the animals. And also, just finally on this, we see that it's just like inherently ridiculous to think that Republicans are just going to like en masse go and protest buying meat, especially when we're not actually banning it. Like, we're not forcing anything on these people. They can still buy meat if they choose to. So this is just a ridiculous claim to make. On the next point of clash in this debate, we've seen what is the impact going to be on vulnerable people. They tried to make a push here about culture and identity, particularly religion. Firstly, just a little bit of context from first. We're not banning it. We were never planning to ban meat. We're not taking away the choice of these people. What we are doing is giving people a more widespread picture. We're giving them the ability to have freedom of choice, as Clara told you, which just went completely unresponded to. And then, okay, so then some rebuttal on this, right? When they tried to talk about religion, we see firstly, this is just generally untrue for the majority majority of the population. Most religions actually really support our case. Religious people who eat meat often have strict rules regarding the production, preparation of meat, so it's really not impacting them. They see animals as being like a gift from God that we don't have dominion over. This is just inherently not true. And the cultures which do, we see that we're not taking this away from them. They still have the ability to do this, and often these cultures are actually far more connected to the land and the animals than non-religious people are. And so we see that this is just not a harm to them because they are already understanding. They already have the freedom of choice and they fully understand what they are doing, and they actually are doing it very, very well. Then the second thing that they tried to tell us here was this really weird point on how it's going to impact masculinity and how it's really important to men to consume meat because it's such a huge part of their identity. Firstly, we'd just like to note they didn't bring any meaningful harms here. So what if men can't eat meat? But secondly, we tell you that, look, we're very sorry if your masculinity is hurt by not being able to eat meat. But like, firstly, there are so many other factors that go into what we see as traditional masculinity. Meat is just one of them. So like, kind of who cares if people can't eat meat? Secondly, if it is that big of a deal, men can like go hunting for their own food. They can still buy meat to have a barbecue on occasion for special events, which what we're doing on our side of the house is we're not taking away their ability to do this, but we are providing them with a reason not to gain all of the benefits that we get on our side of the house, both environmental and for the animals, just principally morally important material here. And that this is just like not true. And then lastly, they just brought us a small point on things like Thanksgiving. Once again, events such as Thanksgiving, special events, right? They can continue as normal, but families now have the ability to weigh up their priorities. We may see change, and if we don't see change, we don't see this as being a bad thing because we still have more awareness within communities, and so more likelihood for people to not eat meat the rest of the year. Finally, on this, the next thing they brought us was around children being exposed to it. Firstly, we tell you that as we have already told you throughout all of our speeches, this is like children are hugely important, and we are building in this factor for them to be more sympathetic, to almost have a little bit of a guilt factor to not eat meat. And also this point here just completely proves our point that if the suffering of animals is considered so absolutely unacceptable, why are we allowing it to continue? Why are we allowing children to eat shrink-wrapped body parts from animals in the status quo? We don't see why this is a benefit on their side of the house. And then also just some like fact-checking sense-checking material here, right? Parents are kind of smart enough to recognize that the children may be uncomfortable if they're too young to understand it. They're just not going to take them down the aisles with meat in them. They're probably going to hide the packaging before they get home, that sort of thing. Secondly, we see that they are more incentivized to have meaningful conversations surrounding what is happening to these animals with their children, meaning that children are going to be getting a better understanding from a young age. They're going to be they're going to have a far, far better ability to actually understand and think about what the consequences of their actions are. And we see that this is not a bad thing, as children are already having to understand difficult concepts such as death and all of that in the status quo. And then finally on this, we just see like, honestly, it's not that important. Like they're exposed to so much nowadays, children, that like, honestly, it's just one of so many factors, video games and all of that, like it's really not that big of a harm. And I will quickly take a POI now before I move on.
What justifies the
so,
disruption
like,
of
what-
the upwards trend in the vegan movement on your side of the house?
Sorry, can you just quickly repeat the start of that?
Sure. What justifies the disruption of the vegan movement in your side of the house?
The disruption of the vegan movement. We don't see any disruption to the vegan movement. If anything, we see a benefit to the vegan movement as fewer people are eating meat. I just really don't see the logic there. All right, and then quickly into the last point of clash here around like what is the impact for other communities. We see, firstly, they told us here that the media are just like not going to do anything about it. We see that they're actually very, very likely to respond as it's unpopular on their side of the house. If they claim that it is unpopular, they're very likely to respond as so many people were invested in it. And then secondly, when it is written into law, these policies, they actually have an incentive to support it to try and calm the population, to not essentially incite riots. We don't see why the media would have any incentive to do this on their side of the house. Okay, and then finally, just on like they talked about the developing world very quickly at the end of their last speech. So firstly, this is really not that important in the debate. But secondly, we see that one, we already told you at first, this really isn't going to impact people that are like buying meat locally and not buying it from large supermarkets. Secondly, we told you they're actually going to see a benefit likely, as these communities are often supported through farming and they're going to get far more plant farming. So these communities are actually going to be benefited on our side of the house. And that is all I have time for. Thank you.
The House thanks the third proposition speaker for that speech and now invites the third opposition speaker to close up the first portion of this debate. Hear, hear.
Am I clear and audible?
Can you read out the motion?
something animal packaging. I forgot the exact wording.
Loud and clear.
All right, nice. Starting in 3, 2, 1. People see mutilated bodies of children in Gaza on their Twitter timeline, and they still don't care. I have to see people dying on Instagram Reels every day, and I've kind of become desensitized to it. The issue is that when you shove this in people's face, people stop caring. However, people stop getting that emotional, visceral reaction. However, they still get mad at this and they still backlash, which is why they fundamentally lost this debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how people react to this. Secondly, I'm going to go into our, pretty unengaged with material on the developing world. Firstly, then on how people react to this. The first thing they said is that you can't display graphic content in supermarkets. I have two responses. Firstly, is that now these meat industries and supermarkets have an incentive to lobby against this. These are quite large industries, right? So they're probably going to be very influential. They can also just say all the stuff we said, right? About how they provide jobs, about how people are really not going to like this policy, about how people really like to engage with and discuss with meat. So this is probably going to be pretty successful lobbying. Secondly, if you believe that people like meat, and if you believe that people like meat and won't just give it up, which is what our case proves, they'll probably just ask the staff to go and grab it from the back anyways. They then said people don't know about this stuff and need the choice to know that they're actually consuming bad stuff. I have two responses. Firstly, animal rights movements are pretty big. They can just use their influence to push all of this stuff in the media and talk about the bad stuff that's happening to animals. Just on our side, they don't need to shove brutalized images in people's faces. So you can still get that principle of choice fulfilled. Secondly, is that I'd say we actually flip this, because if you believe their case and that people are going to react very viscerally to this, you're probably being coerced, right? You're probably making people feel this mass sense of disgust. And note this isn't actually what's on these labels isn't the constant lived realities of these animals, right? This is probably going to be the most extreme, brutal examples on these labels, and this isn't always what they go through. So you're making people believe a false reality, which means that you don't get that principle of choice, and they don't actually fulfill that. So if you believed in that, they had to lose the debate there. Next in, let's explain why this won't work, because we gave you 5 really good mechanisms here, right? Firstly, we said that people can just adapt to this. You can just hide it away in their bag, and when they get home, they can just flip it around and take out their packaging. They conceded to this in third. They then, this means that disgust won't work, and all this stuff around alienation probably won't work. They then said this dilutes our impact, but people are still annoyed that they have to actually do this and have this interruption in their day-to-day lives. They're still mad that the government is intervening in their lives, and they're still mad that animal rights movements are pushing them onto this. So that wasn't a good response. Secondly, we told you this was an integral part of culture, and people really cared about their identities and culture, and they didn't want to give this up, and they were really mad in which you tried to insult their culture and call them all brutal animal psychopath murderers and throw all of that in their face. Fridays, we said that this was a very habitual thing, right? Eating meat is just a part of your week. It's something that you go to in your day-to-day life, which we talked about before. It's just something very normal to you. We think people don't really want to give up those habits. Fourthly, is that we said people just kind of become desensitized to this, right? After seeing it day to day, every week, this just kind of destroys their entire case, right? Because when people see it so much, they kind of just stop caring. It becomes such a normal thing to them because they have to see it so often. So this means that they don't feel disgust and that they still remain alienated. Probably even more on their side, because, if we do it occasionally on our side, then that means that it's a much more visceral, harmful impact, or yeah. They then said and they then repeat the response about how this dilutes our impacts, but as I mentioned previously, it doesn't. Fifthly, we said that just a lot of people get mad at this and will probably start eating more meat out of protest, which means that even if some people opt out of meat, this then means that other crazy people are going to be doubling their meat consumption, so that dilutes all their impacts. This is just fundamentally because people don't like being told what to do, right? They're very stubborn, and when the casual part of their day something they see as their own choice, like choosing to eat meat, gets interrupted, they're just going to be really mad at that, right? They then said, well, there's going to be a lot of discussion and media attention, but why was this going to be positive, right? Like, people didn't actually like, these animal rights movements coming in and shoving like random like animal carcasses in their face. So this meant that the media was likely to capture on that controversy and promote it. They then said the media doesn't want people to go out of control. They said in first that the media likes controversy, which is obviously the much more true example, because media wants controversy to get like clicks and stuff like that. So they were likely to promote this and likely to promote a bunch of backlash. They then said Republicans won't backlash. That's crazy. These are the same people that like went absolutely insane over Bud Light. They're gonna go insane again. We then explained that at the end of this, you just have reduced support from the animal movement as a whole due to three main reasons. Firstly, people are now desensitized to effects on animals. This meant then it was hard to actually get people to care about animals. It's hard for you to say, hey, animals are dying, care about this, because now people are so desensitized to it. So it's hard to continue that messaging the animal rights movement already does. Secondly, is that a lot of people now hate the animals rights movement. They see this an attack on their culture, their children. They see this as a huge instance of government overreach, so they're far more likely to protest against the animal rights movement. Thirdly, is that people that already support it and now being labeled as like psychopaths, a lot of them probably like don't even really support the animal rights movement, like shoving animal carcasses down people's face, meaning then that they're less likely to, be like vegan in the first place, support the movement or protest and stuff like that. This meant that we flipped their entire case because it meant that it was all way harder to pass legislation that was good for animal rights. So they had to lose the debate right there. Before moving on to my second point, I'll take a point.
Yeah, how can your side claim that both children will be super traumatized, but also they're so desensitized to everything nowadays?
Well, they get traumatized at first, then they'll become desensitized. So then let's move on to so they said a couple of things in this trash, right? They said climate change is really important. This is only a small part of agriculture, of the agriculture industry as a whole, and it's only a small part of the wider carbon emissions as a whole. There's still massive industries doing massive carbon emissions. Like, even if you decrease carbon emissions by 30%, climate change is still going to be a problem. There's still 70% of those carbon emissions that are ruining the world, so they probably didn't get that much of a change here. They didn't say deforestation is really bad, but there's still massive incentives to do deforestation, right? Wood is a very important resource. You need to clear it for infrastructure projects and stuff like that. So there probably wasn't much of a change there. They then said, well, rural agriculture isn't going to be that bad because this is large setup costs for animal industries and stuff like that. Well, crops do have those large setup costs they talked about, right? Like having a bunch of land. Note, if you need cheap crops, you need to produce a high volume of crops, which means that you need even more land. Note, meat isn't as bad because a lot of them aren't as free range and stuff like that. Then said, well, a lot of meat industries and stuff aren't free range. They then said, well, it's very labor intensive. Yeah, so we were able to hire a lot of people and get a lot of people jobs. There's a really awesome benefit that we were willing to stand by. They said, well, probably people in developing countries. They then said oh, well, crop industries are going to be better anyways. I have two responses. Firstly, is that crops probably would have been done already. This is a really easy industry to set up. The reason why I didn't do it is probably because there's no arable land. And yeah, I think that responds to that. So then that meant then that this is just an industry you're going to remove, and you're not going to get any other industry replaced instead. Which meant that poor people massively had to lose their jobs. These were people that didn't have transferable skills, like butchers and stuff don't have transferable skills. So that was a massive harm to them, right? And also, they said meat can be bad and that they can hurt your health. I would say that this probably happens more when you have to cut costs and you have to do less safety regulations. But also, people just didn't get cheap nutrients on our side, right? Meat was a really good cheap source of protein. They didn't get that on our side, which meant that they had to stand by poor people losing jobs and being massively malnutritioned. Clearly, we win on that, even if their whole alternative works. At the end of this point, this was clearly a bad method for the animal rights movement to use. Don't support it.
The House thanks the third opposition speaker for that speech. This marks the end of the substantive portion of the debate. We now move into the reply section. I invite the opposition reply speaker. Here.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Today, we've had a debate where they couldn't decide exactly how much meat they're expecting people to consume. Firstly, this should tell you that it's very little meat, but secondly, this should tell you that their case was inherently under-mechanized from the get-go. We've also had a debate where the vegan movement we've proved that the vegan movement would face huge backlash under their side, and they haven't proved how this is justified at all. Comparatively, we told you that on our side, the vegan movement is likely to continue tracking upwards, and we can get their benefits eventually without hitting any of the harms that they will inevitably hit along the way. Okay, 3 points of clash that we have come across in today's debate, right? Firstly, how does this make people feel? Where do these people live? Who are they? And how much we should care about them respectively. Secondly, on the media, how does the media behave? How is it likely to change with this policy? And then thirdly, on the vegan movement, which is perhaps like most important of all in terms of the comparative, right? Okay, so firstly, how does this make people feel? Firstly, we had we ran into the first like key stakeholder, right? It's children. We care about these people because they're vulnerable, because they're developing, right? I think that this, even though this has been a clash throughout all of the debate, I think that this clash on children can be best summed up using a POI heard during the previous speech, right? It was when they said, POI, how do you get both trauma and desensitization in children? We said, here's how, and note that these are both big harms on vulnerable people on their side, right? We told you that they get trauma on their side of the house when they initially see the meat, and then through all the meat in the media that we were promised by their second speaker, and all the public discussion and awareness that we were promised by their first speaker. So that's how we get trauma for children on their side. And then also the children become desensitized. Great, you've ruined a generation's ideas of shopping, of meat, of the media. Awesome source. Okay, the next problem we run into on this first clash of how do people feel is the setting. We told you that in developed worlds, like America, where this is probably likely to look the best on their side of the house, you're just going to get huge counter protests to PETA, right? They took us at their worst and said, oh no, you're not going to get protests of people that want to double their meat consumption. Even if we take them there, and this is an ambitious characterization of theirs, yeah, you probably are likely to see those protests. But even if you just buy PETA counter protests on their side, then we win this. We told you that outside of America, right, in the developed world, this is just unlikely to be effective because people have already seen this. You still get the trauma for children. You still get the desensitization. This is a huge harm. When we win on the setting, when we win on the children, and then when we win on the job loss, we win this point. Secondly, the media, right? Note the clashes on their case. They told us that the media loves controversy, but they're not going to love this controversy. They told us that the media is going to be publicizing like battery farms and live export, but that children won't be able to see it on the 6 o'clock news. With these clashes alone, we should win, but we also told you that the media is likely to just contribute to the backlash, contribute to the trauma, contribute to the desensitization. So we win on this point. Finally, on the vegan movement, right? And this is most important of all, because this is where the comparative kicks in. On our side, we lose nothing by not implementing their policy. Give it 50 years, a lot of people will be vegan anyways. On their side, they risk turning back 30 years of progress of the vegan movement just to institute some ideological policy because the opposing side got ahead of themselves. We told you we're likely to see counter-protests to the vegan movement, and on our side, it just carries on. They didn't engage with us. They told us, oh, you're not likely to see protests where people double their meat consumption. We gave you explicit reasoning why this does actually happen. We win on this point alone because of the vegan movement. So at the end of the day, it's Op who lives in a world with a growing vegan movement. It's Op who brings home the bacon, and it's Op I'm proud to support. But I'll leave it to Clara to come up and tell you how they magically immediately get everyone to reduce meat consumption.
The House thanks the opposition reply speaker for that speech and now invites the government reply speaker to close out this debate.
Just checking I'm all audible.
Yep.
Okay. Just setting up my timer. Okay. Panel, it's extremely unclear to me why NEG thought it was a good strategic decision to come out at leaders and tell you that the vegan movement is the most important stakeholder in this debate. 3 things to do in my speech. Firstly, the question of whether we reduce consumption meaningfully on our side of the house. Secondly, on this idea of the vegan movement. And finally, on vulnerable communities. Okay, firstly, on reducing consumption. We heard 2 main pushes from side of negating. And that was firstly on desensitization and secondly on this like idea of rage bait, along with just like a quick aside that like people don't care about animal suffering. I'm going to start with desensitization. They relied only in their case on this example of Gaza. I gave you really good mechanization at second about how the key difference here is that you can't make meaningful change to children being killed in a genocide. You can make meaningful change to animals being slaughtered at the point in time where you buy out of slaughtering them. We never heard a response. That still stands. What that means to the debate is that desensitization material doesn't stand, and we still get that benefit of people being so repulsed by the slaughter of animals that they buy out, at least to some degree, from the meat industry. The second thing here they told you is rage bait. Again, I flipped this at second. We told you that we stand by more extensive coverage at the point in time where it increases exposure, and that the increases the effect to which our mechanisms work, right? Increases the effect to which people are repulsed by this meat, increases the effect to which they feel a pressure to buy out of the meat industry. Because they never responded to this flipping, I think this material still has to stand. The final thing that really they push on in this class was the idea that people just simply don't care about eating meat. Again, this was really assertive, right? This was never mechanized. We told you why people empathize, why they feel disgust, but also why they easily link this to their animals, to pets that they love. At the end of this clash, I think you have to believe that we get a decrease in meat consumption, even to some extent. Now, Nick can try and say, like, and they have tried to say that a small decrease in meat consumption is like a knife in our case. That's simply not true. Why? Because we told you at Katie how important any decrease in meat consumption was. Even their speakers conceded that we might get 30% less impact on climate change. They told you that it doesn't matter, but at the point in time where 30% less people die from air pollution, I think it does. At the time where there's a decrease in people dying from congestive heart failure, I think that's really important to the debate. Okay, moving on then. So just to note, I think that this is the debate-winning material, right? I think if you believe that we have a decrease in meat consumption, that people are healthier, and that we decrease the negative harms of climate change, and animals are just less likely to be needlessly slaughtered, we win the debate. But if you don't think that, let me address this vegan movement point they made. And this is what Neg thinks that they can win on, because they think that the vegan material is the most important stakeholder in the debate. They tell you that and disrupts the constant upwards tracking of the vegan movement. We tell you that that's like simply ridiculous, right? We told you that what we get on our side is that people who are borderline of being vegan and vegetarian are pushed over the edge. We told you that there is like a network effect where the pressure from other people around you who are disgusted by eating meat also causes you to buy out. And crucially, we told you that it is easier to become a vegan or a vegetarian or reduce your meat consumption when there are more alternatives caused by buying out of the meat industry. That was never responded to, so it still has to stand in the debate. The only mechanisms they gave you here about like disruption to the industry was protests from Republicans. It's unclear why we should care. It's unclear why that meaningfully impacts the progress of the vegan movement, given that they already told you Republicans hate vegans. Lastly, on vulnerable communities, they told you about cultural practices in agrarian communities. I flipped this when I told you about the benefits these communities see when the crops that they primarily sell are like more consumed, right? The only response we heard after that was that there's no arable land, but I think like when you aren't having so much meat, there's land to be gained there. The other group they care about here a lot is children. We told you in the principle why children should know what they're doing when they're consuming like murdered animals, right? It's unclear why this is meaningfully more harmful than watching the evening news or seeing the latest Avengers movie. They didn't prove a proper harm to you here that is exclusive. I'm so proud to affirm.
House thanks the government reply speaker for that speech. This marks the end of this debate and the end of what has been a very exciting tournament for both teams in this room. Thank you very much for a very engaging debate. Please excuse the panel as we'll now go to deliberate. I'm pretty sure the decision for this round will be released with all the other decisions from the ESL final and the Open final. But once again, congratulations to both teams for making it